Welcome everyone to this GIER seminar. I'd like to begin first of all by acknowledging that we are on the unceded lands today of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. I like to pay my respect to elders past and present and extend that respect to all of our Indigenous colleagues and students. Today I'm thrilled to welcome Hichem Darmouche, who is from the Free University of Brussels, and he is presenting on some incredibly interesting, stimulating research that derives from anthropological insights into human behaviour in groups, Mary Douglas's work in particular, and Hichem is doing something very unique here by applying that kind of thinking to education and to learning. So there's lots to look forward to in our presentation today. I'll hand over to Hichem and then we'll come back at the end for a little bit of question time. Over to you. Thanks, Hichem.
Thank you very much for introducing me, and thank you all of you for being here. I'm very glad to share my research with you all today, and I will aim not to speak too much, so we have a little bit time for questions, because I think this is as important as the presentation. So I will talk today about purity as an obstacle to learning about sustainability, and I will clarify in a moment what this concept of obstacle means. But first, I have to introduce perhaps briefly Mary Douglas framework. Perhaps you already know a lot about her work, but in my context, she's not that much read. Perhaps just the anthropologist will hear about her, but not so much in education. So I would like to remind a few things about her work, her kind of old work, but still very relevant here, even in education. So Mary Douglas studied a lot of different kind of perceived dangers around the world with different population, the so-called primitive people. This is how they called other societies 60 years ago. And she have seen many kind of dangers among these populations. So, for instance, leprosy, and you may already know, but in the West, leprosy was kind of a way to when we charge someone with leprosy, it was a lot more about being a deviant or being a marginal rather than a true medical diagnosis, which was the case, in fact, in the Christian East. Leprosy was diagnosed very differently as more as a medical threat. And the threat, in fact, was more about the surrounding with the Muslims, in fact. Other dangers, well, with witchcraft, dietary prohibitions such as the ban of pork, that is actually still the case in many populations around the world. Sexual relations, for instance, she studied this population, the Enga, or the risk of incest among newer. So they had to sacrifice an animal to protect the partners for defilement and so on. So very much a lot of kinds of dangers, very different kinds of dangers, but in fact there are a few commonalities that we can sum up here for these different kinds of dangers. So there are dangers, of course, every time. This danger is a harm caused to ourselves or to others, and which is, in fact, an insidious harm. So it will find one way or another to harm the people. This danger is always a disturbed natural order. So, for instance, the charge of leprosy, as I said, in the West was more about harm and some kind of evil between, well, inside populations with marginals and deviants, which was not the case in the Christian East, where the harm was outside of the Christian society. The defilement and dirt here serves every time to gather people together when a wrong action does not provoke indignation, and there is a high risk of impunity. And I think this is a very important things to highlight here, and I will go back to it in a very few moments about with the plastic pollution example. Purity will help here to manage uncertainty every time, and we'll talk about it in a very few moments, by prescribed prohibitions, rights, values, to call to our responsibility, because, as I said, there is a high risk of impunity. So this is the first framework I would like to remind, but I would like to introduce another framework, which is this idea, this concept of epistemological obstacle from Gaston Bachelard. Well, Gaston Bachelard is kind of our most read epistemologist in the French language framework, but I know that sometimes it is not all read here. So perhaps I will spend a little bit more time here to introduce this concept of epistemological obstacle. But of course, feel free to tell me if it's kind of already known. So let's try to define this epistemological obstacle. Well, the first thing I would like to say is that it's beyond a simple error. So it's not just about a bias to be in an obstacle. It's not a lack of knowledge or a void. It's rather more a fullness when we already know things where we have already constructed knowledge that resists scientific reasoning. So I tried to translate an excerpt from one of his most famous books. When it comes to scientific culture, the mind is never young. It is in fact very old. To embrace science is to rejuvenate spiritually. It is to accept a sudden transformation that must contradict the past. So you see, this is this idea that we are already all full of knowledge, but probably poorly constructed most of the time, well, outside of our research domain, of course. So perhaps all of us in education, we already somehow overcame the obstacle, or few obstacles, but not for our other domains. But we can talk about it a little bit later. The obstacle is the obstacle is a conceptual support. It acts as an anchor. We say in French, déjà là, something's already here. That individuals use to navigate uncertainty and explain daily reality. So this is very useful most of the time to have this poorly constructed knowledge, this common sense. So it's very easy for us to explain, for instance, the daylight and how the day and the night will appear to us every day with this model of the flat Earth, for instance. Of course, we know that from science this is much more complicated, but for most of our daily reality, the common sense is enough. The epistemological obstacle is an inherited facility, a mental habit, or a cultural prejudice that makes common sense explanations self-evident and satisfying. And I think we can see that every day on various medias. There is this principle of knowing against, as you may if you pay attention to the excerpt, it was there. Scientific progress is achieved by breaking away from these obstacles. We must know against our previous intuitions. We are not um, all in a void of knowledge, in fact. And there is this idea of affective roots. So most of the time, obstacles are often supported by familiar, primitive images or childhood fascination that acts as categories. So, such as for these images, a sponge, a foam, sand, and flame. And so there is no such thing as a flame in chemistry and physics. Flame does not exist, in fact. This is just something that we are very used to see and interpret as something that exists, but in fact, this is just the results of a chemical reaction and the light emission. I will give another example. I have a 6-year-old, so now she's 7, but I have a 6-year-old daughter. And of course, I was a science teacher, so she knows a few things about science, such as about rain. So she knows that rain comes from the clouds. But this is not the same thing as being able to explain why. So I asked her how it works to have rain from a cloud. And she told me, okay, there is water, but this is water inside a foam, you see, which I found a very fascinating way to explain things, but not very surprising because as she was a child, she was like almost every day in her bath playing with the foam. So this you see these affective roots that helps to explain various things every day. So I will try to sum up these big ideas. An epistemological obstacle is not a bug, a bias, a common mistake, or it's not just this, but also a profound way of thinking, helpful for everyday phenomenon, and that prevent access to more complicated way of thinking. And I think this is the more important idea with Bachelard here. It's his writing is kind of invitation to think that things in reality are always more complicated than what we could think spontaneously. So it's not a matter to know what is true or what is false. And in fact, sometimes things are kind of true, but also at the same time kind of false when we try to explain a lot of different things every day, but every time more complicated than what we can think as true or just false. So the goal here is also to keep an eye on one's thoughts. Perhaps we can sum up this idea this way. Okay, I'm thinking like this, and it seems to be like this, but perhaps it's probably more complicated than that. So I will try to give an example here. This example just to show you that there are various kind of old research made here by Astolfi and Peter Falvey that tried to overcome this obstacle of gases are not considered matter. So of course, us adults, we are aware that gases are in fact matter, but sometimes we are not even able to explain things with the gases as matter, but this is another topic. So just to show you that things were made in the French language framework, and let's try to understand this example of gases as not considered as matter for most of the pupils. So this is the obstacle. Gases are not matter for most of the pupils. And there's a network of ideas behind explaining the obstacle while we are pupils are in the obstacle. Well, matter is seen as visible and heavy most of the time. Matter is expected to offer resistance. So there is well, my computer right now is on the top of the table, which is very resistant, but I cannot do that with the air around me to turn my computer on it. And a focus on the flame during combustion. What the obstacle prevents from being understood, because this is the main idea here behind the obstacle. Well, photosynthesis, because most of the matter of plants are in fact from carbon dioxide, which is air, which is inside the air, in fact. So, first thing, changes of states including the gaseous phase and chemical reaction involving gases, and also atmospheric pressure. So you see, and thinking that the air is causing pressure to us, it's kind of not easy to really think, even as adults, huh? Right? So you see, this is not just a misconception behind, there is a profound way of thinking in biology, chemistry, physics, and with the same obstacle. And condition for overcoming the obstacle, well, is to recognize that gases have mass. They can be colored, they can be displaced, they can be transformed into liquid, and so on. So there are possibilities to overcome the obstacle with pupils, even when they are kind of young. There are various other examples. I won't read about all, but perhaps we can talk about it a little bit later. I will still give an example. The first one, substantialization. I hope I pronounce it well in English. This is this idea, very, very common, even with the adults, that light, heat, and electricity is in fact a kind of material substance, and which is a very helpful idea to explain various things. Even when we understand how we isolate our house, we talk about heat as a substance that we try to keep inside the house. But of course, when we try to explain things scientifically, this is always more complicated than that. And so there are other various examples. And I think if you want to to work with me next month, that there are some we never wrote about it, such as dualism. So for instance, this opposition with mind versus body, good versus bad, passive and active, left brain, right brain, you see, between rationality and emotion, and so on. So I won't spend too much time, but I think there are still a lot of possibility to work on other obstacles. But let's go back to purity ideas. So are purity ideas epistemological obstacles? Well, I hope that you see that, in fact, we can answer this question by yes. Firstly, because the idea of purity and the contamination, taint, defilement, dirt acts, in fact, as an obstacle, as it serves as a support for living with uncertainty. It is a pre-existing, I said an anchor, I said in French, a déjà là framework that allows one to explain a resolved situation, mostly with a kind of common sense, in fact. And secondly, it's affective foundation through metaphor. You see the use of primitive images of disgust here. And I catch myself one time shouting to my daughter about their room and the mess in in their room, saying something that I can translate like this: your bedroom is a total pigsty, which is not the case. In fact, her rooms were not really dirty at all. It was just a mess. So you see, there is this idea of disorder behind, but also the use of primitive images of disgust, which is very important for purity ideas. And thirdly, it prevents access to a more complicated knowledge, obviously. So we'll try to reach now the education field with the case of teaching about plastic pollution. So this is with an article which was published in French a few months ago, but of course I made a translation thanks to AI, and I checked for the main concepts. So I think the translation is quite correct, and I can read it to you if you want. This is something also that Mary Douglas warned us in the end of her book, that it is not in fact this dangerous approach and this purity approach is not only about primitive people. In fact, we have this kind of purity ideas in our so-called modern societies. And this is one of the dangers that is well gives us a lot of purity ideas. I had this possibility to follow during her training, and then when she actually taught students that was so she was it was during that training, and then I followed her when she was actually teaching, and she was teaching the case here of plastic pollution with a lot of images well, there is matter to discuss. I'm not saying that this is not important and this is not a real harm caused to the so-called nature here, but we will see that it's kind of more complicated than just having disgust for it. But that's it. When she was teaching to her pupils, this is the kind of images she was showing to her students, to the pupils. So if we go back to the commonalities of purity, in fact, we can find everything, every criterion is here in her teaching. So I will just sum up everything here, but of course, the main data are in the article. So there is obviously a danger, which is a harm to fishes, turtles, humans, and this is an insidious harm because, and she said that to her pupils, well, everything you do every day will release plastic, such as brushing your teeth, wearing clothes, because almost every clothes now have plastic, such as riding your car, such as, well, in cosmetics and so on. This danger is a disturbed natural order for her because it's actually disturbing nature, fishes, turtles, of course, but also because plastic should not be in the environment for her. The defilement, the dirt here, and this disgusting images serves to gather people, because these wrong action here does not provoke indignation, or mostly, well, there is a high risk of impunity. If I throw out a bottle now in nature, well, I don't think police will catch me and put me in prison. Well, I don't know in Australia, but in my context in Belgium, there is a high risk of impunity when we throw plastic in the environment. So there's no other choice than having purity ideas. Purity helps uncertainty management because you see, everything you do during your life might release plastic. So when you don't know what to do, well, she said to her pupils, well, the best is probably not to buy and not do anything, in fact. So it prescribes what we can call rights, behaviors at least, and it was, of course, a call to the pupil's responsibility. I have few excerpts, but I probably won't read everything. You can find it in the article, or I can send you the PowerPoints. But I can read few excerpts. For instance, each time we increase the quantity of pollutants in the food chain, and they know very well that we are at the top, so who is that takes the chemicals in the face? It's us. Many of them didn't know the extent to which there is plastic in the small fibers of things, exfoliants, scrubs, and even synthetic fibers. All of that is pollution too. I try not to dictate too much, but clearly proposing solution, I think it's necessary. I think any student who has understood that animals are disappearing because we can't be bothered to put things in the bin or sort them. Showing them that there is something a bit shocking, even if it means voluntarily shocking them a little. Yeah, that sometimes do that to say, yes, it's serious. Last one, explaining to them that nature, well, it's not there to serve us. Okay, so what kind of knowledge purity prevents from? Because if it doesn't prevent from another kind of knowledge, scientific knowledge, then this is not an obstacle. Well, it prevents something, of course, much more complicated that will require a kind of very deep study of a set of interaction between biotic and abiotic compartments, fluxes, flows of matter and energy, which is not easy, and it is probably way more complicated than the puristic approach. I will try to sum up and compare these two possible approaches. So with the purity obstacle, we're more on a static point of view. Plastics are released in the environment, and this is temporary, which is not the case with the ecosystemic framework that I call it like that. This is the scientific framework, in fact, which works with a dynamic point of view. There is as I said, a set of interaction between biotic and abiotic compartment, fluxes of matter and energy. A danger and harm to the so-called nature. Perhaps we can talk a little bit about it later. About nature for me and for a few philosophers is more a myth than a true scientific concept. Versus threats to biodiversity in a set of ecosystemic services. All or nothing with the purity obstacle. Every plastic released in the environment is dirt or defilement, where in the scientific approach, this is more a matter of dose. Pollution versus concentration, physical and chemical transformations. And of course, this perhaps other obstacle of nature, this myth of nature versus sustainability. And I think I will finish on it, so we have enough time for a little bit of talking. I think that when there is a danger and a disorder and disgust and the risk of impunity, then it means that this is a purity idea, and we can find, in fact, purity ideas even in education, and probably as well also. So I made a short survey with 340 teachers, and the data are not published now, but I'm working on it. And in fact, there are educational dangers among teachers. So for instance, the lack of fundamentals, the belief that students cannot learn without perfectly mastering the basics, which will, of course, often prevent tackling complex problems. The transmission of false knowledge, which is a focus on transmitting the truth at school, and which will obscure science as a more critical process of constructing valid models. And I say here valid models and not the truth or the right one. The fear of strong students being slowed down by weak ones. I don't know if it's the case in your context, but this is very much the case in mine. There is this idea that the strong students should not be slowed down by weak ones. So the consequence for that is to segregate by level the pupils in differentiated teaching. So I will stop here. I hope I was not too fast, but I think we can talk a lot about all these ideas. I will be very glad to hear about you. Do you see any danger, disorder, or disgust in your research topic? And thank you very much for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hisham.